Hi everyone, it's Yukimi. Happy holidays. In the previous episode, I talked about names, how they change, split, and adapt depending on context. In this episode, I want to stay with that idea of change, but look at it from a legal and historical perspective. This episode focuses on statelessness, and more specifically, how the legal status of Zainichi Koreans kept shifting over time, almost like a chameleon, not stable, not fixed, constantly adjusting to political circumstances. After Japan's defeat in 1945, the legal position of Koreans in Japan changed abruptly. Under colonial rule, Koreans had been classified as Japanese imperial subjects. This did not mean equality, but it did mean formal legal inclusion within the empire. When the empire collapsed, that legal framework disappeared. Koreans in Japan were no longer treated as Japanese at a moment when Japan itself was struggling to reconstruct its post-war identity and increasingly promoted homogeneity as a national ideal. While Korea itself was not yet recognized as a unified state, for several years, many Koreans in Japan existed in a legal gray zone without clear nationality. In 1952, following the San Francisco Peace Treaty, Japan formally renounced its claim to Japanese nationality for Koreans in Japan. From that point forward, they were legally classified as foreign nationals. For many families, this meant effective statelessness, not always in a narrow international law sense, but in daily life. No state fully represented them, protected them, and claimed them as citizens. Japan does not grant citizenship based on place of birth. As a result, statelessness or near statelessness did not end with the first generation. Children born in Japan to Zainichi parents inherited their parents' legal status. Even if a family had lived in Japan for decades or even generations, that fact alone did not change their nationality. I was born in Japan. My parents were also born there, yet legally I was still classified as Zainichi, which meant that despite generations of my family having lived in Japan, I was not born a Japanese citizen. This is one of the core realities of Zainichi statelessness. It was not confined to the immediate post-war period. It extended into the lives of second and third generation children who had never lived anywhere else. Now let's go back to the history lesson. In the 1950s, the situation became even more complex. As the Japanese empire collapsed, Zainichi Koreans lost not only legal status but also any clear source of political or moral recognition. In this vacuum, many sought a sense of dignity and belonging that had been systematically denied to them in post-war Japan, where discrimination in employment, housing, and education was especially severe. But discrimination did not stop at the level of law. It was deeply embedded in everyday social life as well. During this period, organizations affiliated with North Korea became highly visible within the Zainichi community. These groups established schools, cultural institutions, and support networks, and promoted an ideology centered on ethnic pride, post-colonial resistance to Japanese imperial legacies, and national dignity. It is important to be clear, describing this historical moment does not endorse the North Korean state or its actions. The North Korean regime has committed severe human rights abuses against its own citizens, and those realities are neither minimized or excused here. As scholars such as John Lee have documented, attraction to North Korea under its founding leader, Kim Il-sung, in the 1950s and 1960s cannot be reduced to propaganda alone. For many Zainichi Koreans, both educated and uneducated, this ideology offered something that post-war Japan did not: recognition, structure, and a sense of dignity at a time when they were systematically devalued. Korean schools in Japan, many supported by North Korea-aligned organizations, became spaces where children learned language, history, and collective identity. These schools provided education and affirmation, but they also functioned within a broader Cold War political framework. At the same time, this engagement carried grave consequences. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, a large-scale repatriation program encouraged Zainichi Koreans to migrate to North Korea, often framed as a return, quote-unquote, home. Tens of thousands left Japan under this program. Many were never heard from again, and return was not possible. This chapter of Zainichi history shows how statelessness, social exclusion, and the deprivation of dignity shaped political alignment, often under conditions of limited information and constrained choice. Explaining this context is not propaganda, it is historical responsibility. From the 1970s through the 1980s, increasing numbers of Zainichi Koreans registered as South Korean nationals, often because after Japan normalized relations with South Korea in 1965, South Korean citizenship became the most workable route to obtain more secure residence and travel documentation in Japan, especially when other pathways remained legally constrained or politically blocked. On paper, this meant acquiring a recognized nationality and a passport. However, in practice, the meaning was more limited. Many Zainichi Koreans who registered as South Korean citizens had never lived in South Korea. They were not represented politically, did not participate in election, and often had little practical connection to the South Korean state beyond documentation. Oh, FYI, when I first came to the United States until I became a U.S. citizen a couple years ago, I had a South Korean passport. The passport I couldn't even read. Anyway, legal recognition solved certain problems, travel, paperwork, administrative classification, but it did not fully resolve questions of identity or belonging. Zainichi Koreans were not Japanese, and they were not fully South Korean in lived terms either. Regardless of nationality status, daily life in Japan was governed by the alien registration system. Zainichi Koreans were required to register as foreigners, carry identification at all times, and submit to fingerprinting. Travel abroad required special permission, and re-entry into Japan was conditional. Even those born and raised in Japan were subject to these controls. When I turned 16, I was fingerprinted and issued an alien registration card as required by law. Let me share a brief personal moment that shows how this system worked in daily life. When I was around 9 years old, I remember receiving a call from a police station. My mother was pulled over in Tokyo for something really minor, like one of the taillights were out or something like that. She had her driver's license and car registration with her, but she had left her alien registration card at home. Because her license identified her as a foreign resident, the single omission was enough for the police to detain her until someone brought them the proof of alien registry. I could recall picking up a phone in the kitchen. My grandmother was panicking. A 9-year-old me hailed a cab by myself and brought my mother's registration card to the police station. Of course, it was traumatic and overwhelming, something no child should have to manage. Only much later did I understand that this was not an exception. It was how the system functioned systematically. I will return this story maybe in the near future episode. In the early 1990s, Japan introduced the special permanent residency status for Zainichi Koreans. This status provided greater stability than earlier forms of residence. It acknowledged systematic ties to Japan and reduced some administrative burdens. At the same time, it remained 100% conditional. Special permanent residents were still required to obtain permission to leave the country and to return within a specific period. Failure to do so could result in the loss of status even for people born, raised, and educated in Japan. This meant that legal belonging was still fragile. I lost my own special permanent residency during this period after my mother's death, while I was still in college in the United States and unable to return to Japan within the required time frame. At that moment, legal status did not account for personal circumstances, family disruption, or the fact that Japan was the only country I had ever known as home. Despite having been born, raised, and educated there, my legal right to remain was conditional and could quietly disappear. I'm sharing this story not for sympathy, but to illustrate how conditional even the most secure-sounding status could be. Across these decades, Zainichi legal identity kept changing shape. Stateless, then a foreign national, then a South Korean citizen on paper, then a special permanent resident. Each shift addressed a specific legal problem. None provided full resolution. Legal status adapted to political circumstances, but identity and belonging did not move in the same way. This is why Zainichi identity can feel chameleon-like, constantly adjusting to external systems, never fully anchored by them. This podcast began as a way for me to learn my own history, a history that was not taught in school and rarely spoken about at home. Much of it existed in fragments, silences, and unanswered questions. This is not about blaming individuals. The systems I am describing here were historical and structural. Naming them helps us understand how they worked and how they shaped lives. Before the podcast, the Zainichi Music Project came first. As a long-term vision to explore identity, history, and culture, this podcast became one way that vision began to take shape publicly. As I shared these stories on this podcast and through my behind-the-mic writing on the PianoPod Substack, I began hearing from listeners and readers. Many were not Zainichi Korean, yet they recognized parts of their own histories in these stories. Those exchanges, thoughtful, complex, and human, are the point. By sharing my story, I hope to bring attention to a history that has been overlooked. More than that, I hope that speaking openly about uncertainty and survival allows others to recognize themselves and to know that they are not alone. This episode has focused on statelessness, not as a single legal definition, but as a historical process, one that has changed over time while continuing to shape lives. Understanding this helps explain why questions of identity, silence, and caution persist across generations. In the next episode, I want to move from legal status to social behavior and talk about silence, how it was learned, inherited, and normalized. Well, that's it for today, and thank you for listening. More soon.